Prize-winning journalist, best-selling author, a professor at Princeton, and an ordained minister. A master of his craft, he has written 14 books within the last 2 decades, including the New York Times bestseller, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, as well as his most recent book, America, the Farewell Tour. Here to talk about politics after the Trump presidency, one of America's greatest living intellectuals, Chris Hedges.
Thanks. So I've got 20 minutes, and I'm going to lay out quickly how we got here, why the age of Trump is now going to be normalized with or without Trump, and what I worry, especially with the signing today of the American Rescue Plan, will be the inability on the part of the ruling Democratic elites to counter this movement which Trump embodied. So first of all, if you go back 3-4 decades, there was a very concerted assault. It began in 1971, if you want to fix a date to it, when the business elites decided to respond to what the political scientist Samuel Huntington called our excess of democracy. What Huntington was referring to is the rise of popular movements in the 1960s, not just the anti-war movement, but the women's movement, the environmental movement. Ralph Nader, I'm very close to Ralph. I was a speechwriter when he ran for president, founded the first Earth Day, indigenous groups like AIM, the Black Panthers. And so this frightened the ruling elites. And they mounted a concerted and unfortunately exceedingly successful campaign to roll back that opening and close the or shut down or eradicate the programs that had addressed social inequality, many of them put in place by the New Deal, but also by Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And if you read the Lewis Powell memo, 1971, Powell was the attorney for the Chamber of Commerce, later was appointed to the Supreme Court. He really lays out how that assault will be carried out. And that meant creating think tanks like the Heritage Foundation. It meant flooding money into the universities to essentially buy loyalty in political science departments, economic departments. It meant taking control of the airwaves. It meant using that money to demonize, marginalize, and push out of the mainstream critics of neoliberalism. I recommend very highly David Harvey's book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism never made any economic sense. It was based on the fringe elements of the of economic theorists, Hayek, and this kind of third-rate novelist, Ayn Rand, etc. But it made sense in terms of justifying the pillage by the ruling elites, which is all that really mattered. And people who didn't pay fealty to this neoliberal ideology were really ruthlessly silenced. I knew Sheldon Wolin. He died a few years ago, but certainly our most important contemporary political philosopher, taught at Berkeley, later at Princeton. And Wolin was shut out in the 80s from the New York Review of Books and all the other publications he used to write for, because he was calling neoliberalism out as a con. And so with the perpetuation of this ideology, the idea that if you deregulate the market, this will stimulate the economy, and there will be that kind of magical trickle-down effect, which of course is a myth. And in fact, what it does is accrue political and economic power to that tiny oligarchic elite, which is of course where we are now. The 664 billionaires just during the pandemic alone saw their wealth increase by 44%. That's $1.3 trillion. So all of those critics, Nader, of course, became a pariah. Nader was actually by name targeted within the Powell memo. And they gathered such force within both the social, cultural, and political establishment that in order to survive politically, you had to pay fealty to them, which is how you got the figure like Bill Clinton. Clinton, much like Tony Blair, Clinton transformed the Democratic Party into the Republican Party and pushed the Republican Party so far to the right it became insane. And he, with Biden was a major architect in the Senate at the time. He passed NAFTA, the greatest portrayal of the working class since the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act. He passed the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill, which exploded the prison population. We had about 300,000 people incarcerated in 1970. We now have 2.3 million. Militarized the police. Glass-Steagall, which was a 1933 New Deal era piece of regulation that built a firewall, in essence, between commercial and investment banks. They ripped that down. That precipitated the global financial meltdown of 2008 and the banking crisis. And it's interesting, if you looked at Canada during that same period, they didn't have a banking crisis. Banks didn't close right and left because their version of Glass-Steagall had not been repealed. He deregulated the FCC. This is under Clinton, so that the airwaves are now controlled by about a half dozen corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, and that is about what 90% of most Americans listen to or watch. And so we essentially entered that era after the Clinton administration of what I would call the faux liberal. I write at length about this in my book, Death of the Liberal Class. So the faux liberal is the person like Clinton, like Obama, to a lesser extent like Biden. The reason Obama picked Biden is that he essentially voted Republican. But it's the people who are tolerant on cultural, societal issues in terms of race or gender equality, but assiduously serve corporate power. And I think this was emblematic within the Obama administration, where after Obama was given a mandate after the 2008 crash, and he immediately turned his services to bolstering Wall Street, and the banking industry became what Cornel West called a black mascot for Wall Street. It's also important to note that Obama's assault on civil liberties outdid even those of George W. Bush. The misuse of the Espionage Act 9 times, I believe, under the Obama administration to go after whistleblowers. That's, of course, how they went after Snowden, how they've gone after Julian Assange. So this juggernaut rolled forward, and I think the rise of Trump was tied directly to Obama's very flagrant betrayal of the working class and of the mandate in which he had been given to confront the elites, and his refusal, of course, to do so. Why do you get a figure like Trump? Clearly a con artist, vulgar, crude, inept, a narcissist, because there is so much pain, especially among the white working class. Not that there isn't more pain among marginal communities, people of color in urban areas, but we have to remember that the 2 primary forms of social control in those areas are now so draconian and so fierce that it makes any kind of organized resistance almost impossible. What are those? Those are the police, militarized police, which now function as internal armies of occupation, and of course the system of mass incarceration. I teach in the New Jersey prison system through Rutgers in their college degree program, and most of my students, at least half of my students in those classes, wouldn't be there but for Clinton and Biden. The idea that you can be locked up for life for nonviolent crimes. 40% of the people in our prison system are never charged with physically harming another person. And most of them, 94% of them, never get jury trials. They're forced, coerced to plea out. And as Michelle Alexander has pointed out, if everybody went to demanded their right to a jury trial, the system would collapse. So you have people railroaded into the prison system, enhancement laws, under terrorism laws, under Biden's 94 omnibus crime bill. Sentences are doubled, tripled, even quadrupled what they are in other countries. And so the mechanisms of police who have essentially stripped away any due process or habeas corpus, coupled with the prison system, has effectively shut down those communities. The white working class suffered, not to the same extent, but they have suffered through deindustrialization. And as Crane, Brinton, Jeffrey Davies, and other theorists of revolution have pointed out, those who rise up when you create societal rebellions do so primarily because their expectations are thwarted. It's interesting, Baldwin, I think you can't understand America if you don't read James Baldwin, but Baldwin at one point writes about why African-American men in particular don't have the same kind of midlife crisis that white men have. And he said because it's Black people very early on learn that the myth of America, of American exceptionalism, of meritocracy is a lie. But white men are more susceptible to it because up until recently, they benefited from it through white supremacy. But all of that has been washed away. I was in Anderson, Indiana for my last book, America, the Farewell Tour, with old UAW workers. Anderson used to be a center for GM, 25,000 union jobs, averaging about $25 an hour or more with benefits. All of that got taken away with NAFTA. The plants were not just shut down, they were actually bulldozed and destroyed. So they're weed-choked, gigantic compounds surrounded by cyclone fencing. And the city went into the usual death spiral that happens when those social bonds are ruptured, with the opioid crisis becoming an epidemic, suicides, which are highest among white men, supermarkets closed, churches boarded up, weed choked lots, people abandoning their homes because they can't pay their mortgages, etc. And those old UAW workers, this was back in 2016, voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary, but they voted for Trump in the general election. Why? Why that swing from a Sanders to a Trump? It's because the anger towards the Democratic Party elites is particularly fierce. Because the betrayal was deeper. The Democratic Party, which once took into account the concerns of labor, continued after they betrayed the American working class to speak in that feel your pain language of liberalism while they thrust a knife into the back of the American working class. And that's what really gave rise to Trump. It is simplistic to blame a rise of a figure like Trump on racism or on Russia, which is absurd. Of course, the country that interferes most in our electoral process is not Russia, China, it's Israel. And that interference is so powerful that no administration can essentially challenge Israeli policy. Biden isn't going to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv from Jerusalem, even though that is a flagrant violation of international law. So what you saw with Trump was a figure who essentially was vulgar, crude, but expressed that anger towards the ruling elites that has gripped the American white working class. And of course, what Trump has done, like all demagogues, is single out scapegoats, Muslims, although Islamophobia predated Trump, Muslims, undocumented men and women, liberals, GBLT community, etc. And I think it's important to note that Trump himself had no real ideology. But that ideological vacuum was filled by the Christian right. I wrote a book about a decade ago called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. I did not use the term fascist lightly. First of all, I come out of a religious tradition. My father was a Presbyterian minister. My mother was a seminary graduate, was a professor. I graduated from Harvard Divinity School. I'm actually even ordained. as a Presbyterian minister. But the belief system itself is heretical. The whole idea that Jesus came to make us rich, or that God or Jesus blesses the white race above other races, especially the American white race, to establish the kingdom of God, is ridiculous. We can begin with the fact, of course, that Jesus wasn't white. Jesus was a person of color. The Romans were white. Or that Jesus would bless the dropping of iron fragmentation bombs all over the Middle East. And it was the failure of the liberal church, which I come out of, to denounce these people, to confront these people for who they were. The fascism, as Paxton writes in Anatomy of Fascism, or go back to Fritz Stern, or even Hannah Arendt, it always entails magical thinking, but it also fuses the iconography and language of the movement, of the fascist movement, and that iconography and language is one that reaches within to the kind of cultural heritage, whatever country you're in, with the state itself. There was in Germany under the Nazis, the German Christian Church, where you had the swastika on one side of the pulpit and the Christian cross on another. And my great mentor at Harvard, James Luther Adams, had been in Germany in 1935 and 1936 until he was picked up and expelled by the Gestapo. He was working in the underground church led by Niemöller and Bonhoeffer. And he saw in the Christian right that kind of replication of the German Christian church. So that will, and Trump brought all of these figures, Pompeo, Pence, Betsy DeVos, who come out of this Christian nationalist or Christian fascist movement into the administration, and they have remained his most loyal base. And I think that under the direction of a competent fascist, especially cloaked in that Christian garb, we will see, following the Biden administration, the cementing into place of an authoritarian or proto-fascist movement with that kind of Christianized veneer. So just in the last few minutes, I want to address the 1.9 trillion COVID-19 relief bill, the ARP, which it does not address the structural inequities. It doesn't raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. It doesn't impose taxes and regulations on corporations. It allows the healthcare system to remain privatized. That means insurance and pharmaceutical corporations will, through the ARP, reap a windfall of tens of billions of dollars and are already making record profits during the pandemic. It will do nothing to halt the endless wars in the Middle East, the bloated military budget. It will not curb or regulate predatory global speculators on Wall Street that profit from massive levels of debt peonage to students, underpaid workers, and that loot the US Treasury. There will be no campaign finance reform to end our system of legalized bribery. It won't break up the giant tech monopolies. It won't curb the fossil fuel companies from ravaging the ecosystem. It won't demilitarize the police. In fact, Biden's called for more money for police, which has always been the problem. It is promoting censorship by digital media platforms. I was opposed to taking Trump off of digital media for reasons we can discuss. It won't carry out prison reform. So what does the act do? Well, it offers a kind of momentary respite from the country's death spiral. You send out one-time checks of $1,400 to 280 million Americans. You extend $300 weekly unemployment benefits till the end of August. You distribute $3,600 through a tax credit for children under the age of 6, $3,000 for children ages 6 to 17, started on July 1st. And where will this money go? Well, it will go into the pockets of landlords, lenders, medical providers, credit card companies. And the question that we all have to ask is what happens to the majority of Americans who get this support for only a few months? What are they going to do when the money stops arriving by the end of the year? And will the federal government orchestrate another massive relief package? I don't think so. It essentially puts you right back to where you started. And I think that the myopia or naivete of the ruling elites is that they somehow think Trump was a kind of freakish anomaly. And they think they can make Trump and his supporters disappear by banishing them from social media and recreate the ancien regime with that kind of decorum of the imperial presidency and respect for procedural norms and choreographed elections and fealty to neoliberalism. And I think what the elites have failed to grasp, despite the fact that Biden barely beat Trump, and despite the storming of the Capitol by this enraged mob on January 6th, is that their credibility is dead. That the Trump era, if not Trump himself, is the future. And that the ruling elites embodied by Biden and the Democratic Party, as well as the kind of polite wing of the Republican Party represented by Jeb Bush or Mitt Romney, is headed for the dustbin of history. And I think that's 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was great. I don't imagine you speak at many weddings.
I've only done one, and it was for one of my students who got out of the prison after 31 years. So.
Okay, so now we're going to transition to the next part of the evening. I'm going to ask Chris a few questions, and then afterwards we'll do a Q&A with the audience. So for your first question, it seems that your main focus lately, if not since the beginning of this century, has been in trying to expose the reality of humanity's near future existential crisis. Would you say that's true?
Political and existential. I mean, the existential crisis is through the climate emergency. But I would say that all of my writing and all of my books have focused on the dysfunction of the American political and economic system and the consequences of that. And, one book tends to lead to another. I write a lot out of Poor Communities, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, which I did with the cartoonist Joe Sacco, is written out of the poorest communities in America, these sacrifice zones like southern West Virginia, which has been turned into a toxic wasteland because of mining, in particular mountaintop removal, billion-gallon impoundment ponds with carcinogens and heavy metals.
Was there a specific turning point that marked the beginning of this focus?
I was outside the country for 20 years. So when I came back, I think the changes within the country are more dramatic, not least of which is because when I was a seminarian at Harvard, the Christian right was a very marginal force. And by the time I returned, they were a very powerful political force. So that was quite striking. And then just the way that the liberal wing of the Democratic Party had been eviscerated. And I have to credit a lot of my understanding of corporate power to Ralph Nader. Ralph understands corporate power and has been fighting it with probably more integrity than any American. And Ralph watched, especially with the rise of the Clinton administration, how the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, those people who cared about labor and passing or supporting social programs, were just pushed out by the party, which is why Ralph finally ran for president, because he said, and I agreed with him, that at this point, the only pressure we can bring to bear on the Democratic Party is to pull 5, 10, 15 million people away from the party as a counterweight within a third party to make them respond. So I think it was a combination of being outside the country for so long. So I was more attuned to the changes, which have been gradual, but which were more dramatic to me. And then also the fact that I had a good tutor in Ralph, who essentially, both through our relationship, but also in the books he gave me, Sheldon Woolen's great work, Democracy Incorporated, helped me understand what was happening.
Ralph ran against Al Gore and President Bush in 2000. Is that true?
He ran against, yes.
Well, looking back, wouldn't you say that's a mistake? Because no. Al Gore would have been a much better president than...
Of course, Al Gore. But Al Gore ran such a tepid campaign. He, number one, couldn't carry his own home state of Tennessee. And number two, the Republican Party effectively disenfranchised 300 and some thousand voters in Florida They only counted 2 counties, the Supreme Court, which was anointed Bush by overturning any known legal mechanism, stopped the counting in 2 counties. So I think the Democratic, Ralph frightened the Democratic Party, which is why they turned on him after 2000. But and of course they sought to demonize and blame Ralph for the election of Bush. But that's just patently false. And even now, Gore says that the election was stolen, which it was, by the Republican Party.
Was there a time that you were hopeful for humanity and/or America?
Well, I spent most of those 20 years covering conflicts and wars, so I certainly was in touch with the worst of human evil, and I was just a boy in the 60s. My father was involved in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the gay rights movement. His brother, my uncle, was gay, and my father had a particular sensitivity to the pain of being a gay man in America in the 50s and 60s. He was very vocal and the church finally pushed him out for it, but very vocal in support of GBLTQ rights. So I think then I had a kind of hopefulness when we had mass movements that were pushing back against these rapacious centers of power, especially at the end of the Vietnam War, when there was a lot of soul searching in America. We asked questions about ourselves that we hadn't asked before, that we should be asking now. But of course, all of that is gone under this counter assault, which I talked about at the beginning.
How would you rank Trump relative to the other American presidents?
Oh, he's probably the worst. I never thought after George W. Bush we could get worse than that. But yeah, he's certainly the worst president in American history. Yeah.
Wow, really? You really
I would say,
so?
Yeah, probably.
So Noam Chomsky, a friend of yours, I believe, was adamant about voting for Joe Biden, much to some of the left's chagrin. Considering you have much in common with Chomsky politically, why do you think you felt so differently?
Noam has always pushed that position. I don't agree with Noam. I also clash with Noam because I support the BDS movement, which he doesn't. I once did a talk with Noam a couple of years in San Francisco. I hate arguing with Noam Chomsky, but
yeah, I can imagine that.
But I do. I mean, I think Ralph is right. I think that politics is a game of fear, and that the only way to make the Democratic Party respond, and the only reason the elites responded in the 60s wasn't because they had a walk with me Jesus moment. It's because they were scared of these movements. I mean, there's that scene in Kissinger's memoirs where I think it's 71, the White House is surrounded by tens of thousands of anti-war demonstrators, and the Nixon White House has put empty city buses in a ring around the White House to protect it. And Kissinger writes that Nixon's standing at the window, terrified, going, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. And that's where we want people in power to be. That's our job.
Did Trump not have a similar moment this last summer?
I don't think the threat, I mean, it wasn't tens of thousands of people, but it was enough people that he was spooked, and that's a good thing. He did run to the bunker, I guess.
Do you think President Biden presents a better opportunity for positive political and economic change over Donald Trump?
No, Biden was anointed, selected by the corporate elites. They made that clear. The Democratic donor party class, people like Lloyd Blankfein, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, were very public about saying that if Sanders was the nominee, which was never going to happen, the establishment was never going to permit it, they would vote for Trump. They didn't like Trump. He was an embarrassment to the empire, but they could live with him. And so they all got behind Biden. Obama did a lot of dirty work behind the scenes to make sure Biden was elected, because they know that he won't challenge these structures of power. So I don't, and I fear that what I look at the Biden administration as analogous to the 1932 administration government of Franz von Papen in Germany. So everybody was spooked by the rise of the Nazi Party after the 1929 crash. So the old conservative elites centered around von Papen created the government to recreate, like Biden, the old ancien regime, and this kind of conservative utopianism. And by the way, imposed all sorts of censorship on the Nazi Party and the fascists as well, much as you've seen Silicon Valley try to do, the digital platforms. And within a year, Hitler was in power. So I think that with my fear with the Biden administration is that the refusal on their part to address the social inequality almost guarantees the rise of probably a competent fascist. Dystopia comes. I covered the war in Yugoslavia. I've watched this stuff. The figures, 2019, it was already horrific. The bottom 50% of households had only 1% of the nation's wealth. The top 10% had 76%. That was all before the pandemic. More than 18 million Americans now depend on unemployment benefits. And this is as businesses close and contract. 81 million Americans say they can't meet basic household expenses. 22 million Americans say they lack enough food on a daily basis. 11 million can't make their house payments. So either you carry out the deep structural FDR type New Deal legislation, or history has shown what this kind of grotesque income disparity will do. And the Biden administration, and if you look at the bill he signed today, they've made it very clear that they're not going to do these structural changes, even raising the minimum wage, which in real terms, the New York Times had a story about a year ago that talked about how productivity has risen since I think the 70s or something by 77%. And that if the minimum wage had kept pace with productivity, the minimum wage right now would be $20 an hour. But of course, it's remained the same. I think it's 9 years or something. So in real terms, the minimum wage has declined. And the fact that they can't raise it is really just criminal.
Yeah, it would hurt too many shareholder stock prices.
Well, they want a broken underclass because they're easily manipulated. Real unemployment, of course, is far beyond official statistics. If you work 1 hour a week, you're technically counted as employed. If you work for Walmart, I think the average person at Walmart works 28 hours a week. They're still below the poverty line, so they all qualify for food stamps, so we can subsidize the Walton fortune. If you stop looking for work, I think it's after 6 weeks, you're magically erased from the unemployment rolls. So the LA Times estimated that real unemployment is probably about 17%.
Like Chomsky, you do not think the political left has any business operating with tools of violence or force. But how can you believe in such absolute moral principles when they seem to contradict your assertion that we are doomed by a ruling elite who will stop at nothing to kill us all?
Because they won't work. There's a practical quality to it. Violence is a language the state can speak far better than the rest of us. And the only mechanism we have is essentially, and that's why I support Extinction Rebellion, is sustained acts of mass civil disobedience with the end aim being to overthrow the ruling global elites. I'm not a pacifist. I was in Sarajevo during the war, and we were surrounded by Bosnian Serb forces that were dropping hundreds of shells a day in the city. The city was protected by a trench system. We knew that if the Bosnian Serbs broke through that trench system, a third of the city would be slaughtered and the rest would be driven to displacement and refugee camps. That wasn't conjecture. That's what happened in the Vukovar Valley and the Drina Valley and Vukovar and other places. So at that point, you don't have an option. Nobody was sitting in basements in Sarajevo while they were being shelled talking about pacifism or nonviolence. But that doesn't save you from the poison of violence. That is all explored in my book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. But when you essentially are trying to internally overthrow a power, unless you have a neutral, or more than a neutral, a friendly country on your border, the way Tunisia bordered Algeria. So Tunisia was used as a kind of staging area, arms shipment base and everything for the FLN when they were overthrowing the French in Algeria. It's because you logistically can't do it. The same way that the FMLN in El Salvador, and I covered that war, depended on logistical support from Nicaragua. It's practically impossible. So it's not like we have a choice.
I think a lot of people would disagree with you, though, and especially
a lot of people, that's probably true.
Especially, on the political left, people who share your opinions. I've noticed that you've gotten in trouble from the left by basically telling them not to be violent. But if you say it's not possible, but that seems to contradict another conviction you have, that so what if it's not possible? We fight anyway.
Well, I would say that is, if you look back at all the great revolutionaries, Che, and I mean that they went in it out of a kind of what the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr calls sublime madness. Most revolutionaries don't think they're going to succeed. In fact, most don't. So yes, I think that one has a moral duty to resist, even if you're not going to succeed. In terms of effectiveness, I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe, which were nonviolent. So I was in East Germany, which is the most sophisticated security surveillance state until our own. And it was begun by Lutheran clergy, mostly in Leipzig, marching through the streets, holding candles, this kind of stuff. And 70,000 people were there, and the regime under Erich Honecker got nervous, and they sent down an elite paratroop division to crush the protests, and they refused to deploy and fire on the crowds. That's how revolutions work, that no revolution succeeds until a significant section of the security apparatus either defects or refuses to defend a discredited regime. And that's the point that we have to get to. And that isn't going to be achieved by carrying out acts of violence, because acts of violence allows the state to demonize the movement. You never get the numbers, which is what they want. If you look at Occupy, which I spent a fair bit of time in Zuccotti, it wasn't particularly radical. They all thought they were radicals, but it wasn't that radical. It was pretty mainstream. And look at how the state furiously tried to, and the media was part of this, to demonize these people. And I think what frightened the state was when, especially on the weekends, when these mothers and fathers would come from New Jersey and push their strollers up and down Zuccotti. That terrified the state. So we need the numbers. I mean, I was in Alexanderplatz when 500,000 people were in front of the Communist Party headquarters denouncing them. I was in Wenceslas Square when 500,000 people were gathering on the streets of Prague. That's the only mechanism.
Well, wasn't that? A lot of historians would argue that was just sheer ineptitude on behalf of a state capitalist system that was coming undone, like all state capitalist systems come undone by, they had a war in Afghanistan. They were being outcompeted by China and America. Their economies fell apart. So therefore,
well, but that there is important truth to that. But that's also where we are. I mean, I travel around this country, and our cities are just one decayed wreck after another. The endless folly of these wars, which neither the generals or the politicians or anyone else is held accountable for, perpetuate themselves. And then when they finish their military service, they go off to Raytheon, and then they go back to become the Secretary of Defense. I would argue that, we are in the process of internal disintegration, as was the old Soviet Empire. I would say that's true.
Okay, but then there is a power vacuum, and a lot of people on the left would say that a party would need to fill that power vacuum.
Well, you make a good point there. I mean, I think the problem with the left is that it's too addicted to social media and kind of flash mob type events. That organizing is a very laborious and timely operation. And we don't have, you're right, the kind of organizational structures that the radical left in the United States created before World War I and then in the 1930s with the breakdown of capitalism. So that's why I fear the propensity we have towards proto-fascism, because the left is so weak. I mean, the left was assaulted. It's not completely the fault of the left in the name of anti-communism, but that is a deep concern of mine.
So would you say that the solutions to these problems, would you say they're rooted in a revolutionary organizing structure?
Yes. I mean, so if you go back to Crane Brinton or any of these other theorists on revolution, they always talk about at the inception of revolutionary movements, they coalesce around a demand that the ruling elites can never accept because it would mean their own disintegration. And I think that's right. And that is, by the way, what Occupy did. I mean, Occupy wasn't outside of Wall Street by chance. They understood that's where real power lay.
You were thinking of running for political office last year.
Well,
what stopped you?
What stopped me was apparently there's some FCC rule that you can't have a national television show and run for office, which I was unaware of. I only did it.
That's true, though.
Huh?
Is that a real law?
Apparently it is. I wasn't going to run a real campaign, but normally the Green Party runs a candidate in my district every year, and then this year in the last election they didn't for some reason, and so they called me up. It was so I could sit in on the debates. It's so I could challenge, in particular, Bonnie Coleman, the Democrat, who's a establishment Democrat, and so it was a way to raise issues. I wasn't going to run a serious campaign, but that got nixed when I didn't want to lose my show.
Do you think
for that? Since I wasn't running a serious campaign anyway, it make any sense?
Do you think you will run in the future a serious campaign?
I don't want to run for office. I mean, it was totally done to help muck up the system and not let these people get away with what they get away with and call them out.
You generally don't believe that there's an electoral solution to our national and local problems?
No, I think that without movements, there's no solution. I mean, Howard Zinn made this point repeatedly. That doesn't mean, I mean, I vote. I don't vote. I didn't vote for Biden. I mean, I vote third party. But, this is, as Emma Goldman said, if voting was that effective, it'd be illegal. We have to build movements to hold power in check. That is the only way. And that's the brilliance of Zinn's book, The People's History of the United States, where he understood that ruling white aristocratic male slaveholders created a closed system. They were terrified of direct or popular democracy, as they repeatedly documented in the Federalist Papers. And it was only through the building of a series of popular movements that we opened up space within the democratic system. And now that space is closed. I mean, even to the point where we're rolling back voting rights legislation.
You told Julian Casablanca, I'm going to skip that question, sorry about that. Could you tell us a little bit about why and how you sued President Barack Obama?
So Obama signed into law at midnight on 2011, the National Defense Authorization Act, which included for the first time Section 1021. Section 1021 overturned the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, which prohibits the military from being used as a domestic police force. It essentially stripped US citizens of the right to habeas corpus and due process, allowing them to be snatched off the streets if they were deemed to be supporters of Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or quote unquote associated forces, a nebulous term that could mean anyone, and held indefinitely without trial. And so the lawyers, Bruce Afron and Carl Mayer, and I sued Obama in the Southern District Court in New York. Now, there's a perfect example. No one thought we were going to win. We didn't think we were going to win, but we didn't want to let the Obama administration get away with it and not resist. And much to our own surprise, we did win. And then the Obama administration freaked out. And so the judge issued a temporary injunction. The Obama administration sent lawyers from the NSA up to New York to demand that the injunction be lifted. The judge, Catherine B. Forrest, refused, to her credit. That was a Friday. On Monday, they went to the Second Circuit Appellate Court and demanded that they be allowed to file an appeal and that the injunction be lifted until the appeal was heard. The Second Circuit agreed. But it's such a black and white issue. It's so patently unconstitutional that the Obama administration was in a kind of quandary. And so they had to figure out how to allow this to go forward while not essentially, because they couldn't argue the legal merits of it. And so I had also been was one of the plaintiffs in Clapper versus Amnesty International. This was before Snowden. We had sued through the ACLU, through Amnesty International. We had sued over wholesale surveillance, and we'd argued that journalists were being monitored by the state, and the government in the Supreme Court argued that this wasn't true. In fact, said that if any of us were being monitored, the government would tell us. It all turned out to be a lie, we now know. And so the Supreme Court threw the case out, and the Second Circuit, which I've been sitting on my case, Hedges versus Obama, then immediately said, well, Hedges doesn't have standing in Clapper versus Amnesty International, therefore he doesn't have standing to bring the case, the right to bring the case, and they threw it out. And then we filed a cert or a petition to the Supreme Court, but they wouldn't hear it, so it's law.
So you lost, basically.
Yeah, but we created a mess for them, and we didn't let it go unnoticed.
Yeah, thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. Given your concern over the welfare of human civilization, what set of actions would you advise anyone watching this to take on?
Well, I mean, the climate emergency is really frightening when you read the climate science. I mean, I became vegan because of that, because of the animal agriculture industry and what it's doing to the environment. And there's a good film with a kind of silly title called Cowspiracy, but watch it. It kind of lays it out. Actually, I saw the film and that was kind of it. So that's something you can wake up tomorrow and do. And it turns out it's better for you anyway. You shouldn't be eating all that garbage. But yeah, that's why I'm kind of involved with Extinction Rebellion, because they realize there's no time left and that the ruling global elites are not going to respond to the greatest existential crisis ever to confront the human species and every other species.
Okay. Thank you so much for answering those questions, Chris. We're going to move on to the Q&A. So we'll be taking questions both from, there's a Q&A option. If you're an audience member, you can type those in. And we will also have people come in on video. So the first person, Simon Buhadana, I hope I said that right. He's a senior at Brooklyn College. Aaron, could you bring him up?
Hey, can you hear me?
I can. We can, and we can see you.
Okay. Hey, Chris Hedges. I wanted to let you know, considering your experience with working with independent campaigns like Ralph Nader, do you ever see a situation where the two-party monopoly's grip on power on this country can ever be broken? And if so, how? Thank you.
So the established elite in the two parties is already completely discredited. And that's why Trump just walked all over the the Mitt Romneys and the Jeb Bushes and everyone else. And so the ruling elites have really only one option left, and that is to use the more naked and harsher forms of internal control to maintain power, which they will do. I don't have any hope that any reform will come through the system. At this point, I think it will take an uprising, massive amounts of sustained civil disobedience, as I saw in Eastern Europe, to bring these people down. And I think that there's enough rot within the system that a lot of people aren't going to want to risk themselves to defend it. But I think that's all we have left.
Nadav?
Oh, sorry about that. I was on mute. Sorry about that. Someone asked over text, what is the difference between neoliberalism and liberalism?
Ralph hates the word neoliberalism, always tells me to stop using it. So liberalism,
I agree.
is part of a capitalist democracy, a liberal center. And this is Chomsky. So, but I agree with Chomsky on this. So Chomsky said, the liberal class is tolerated in capitalist democracy because it ameliorates, it acts as a kind of safety valve. So it will deplore the excesses of the system. It will ameliorate the system enough to stave off popular uprising or popular discontent. So the classic example of liberalism working was the 1930s with Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt, in his private correspondence, which I've read with his brother, which was published after his death, he talks about revolution. And he's saying, in essence, to the oligarchs, we have to give up some of our money now. Otherwise, they're going to take all of our money. And as Roosevelt said, his greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. That's when liberalism functions. So there are no jobs. The government creates 12 million jobs under the New Deal, Social Security, all this kind of stuff. That is liberalism working to protect the capitalist system. But what happened after World War II is that in the name of anti-communism, of course, they wiped out all the radical movements. And we have to remember that tens of thousands of people were even down to high school teachers, and Alan Schrecker has written 2 good books on this. The FBI would show up at a high school with a list of teachers with no evidence, or most of them were not members of the Communist Party, but they had a social conscience, and they were out, they were blacklisted, they could never get a job again. I.F. Stone, the great investigative journalist, all sorts of figures in Hollywood. It's why Charlie Chaplin and Orson Welles and others went to Europe. The myopia of the ruling elites is that they turned on the very liberal establishment itself, and that's when you created this kind of faux liberalism embodied in figures like Clinton or Obama or Biden, who aren't liberals really. So that is liberalism. Neoliberalism is really unfettered, unregulated capitalism, where you lift all of the controls on a market economy. And so that market economy is allowed to commodify everything. Human beings become commodities, the natural world becomes a commodity that they are then permitted to exploit until exhaustion or collapse. And the great book on that is Karl Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation, written in 1944. But it's a study of what happens when you deregulate financial systems. And in Polanyi's words, you create a mafia economy, and then you create a mafia state. And he's right.
Chris, you sound downright Marxian.
I'm not a Marxist. I don't think anybody did a better critique of capitalism than Engels and Marx. I would really want to know, and I have slogged my way, at least for the first volume of Capital. I'm not Marxist in the sense that I don't buy his kind of inverted Hegelian solution. But in terms of understanding capitalism, Marx is unparalleled. And you really can't, honestly, I think, be even remotely knowledgeable about economic systems if you haven't read Marx or Engels' great work, the condition of the working class in England in 1848 is brilliant.
Thank you for that. Do you believe that, Lucas asks, do you believe that internet censorship, such as the suspension of Trump's account, is a step in the wrong direction? If so, how do we reduce misinformation and propaganda without regulating it?
Right. So the question is, who is regulating it? And these are large, monopolistic corporations that are utterly opaque. They know everything about us. We know nothing about them. There's no transparency. And most of the people handling their censorship are taken from the security and surveillance apparatus. So I was opposed to, I don't want to read Trump's tweets any more than anyone else does, but I was opposed to taking him off the internet like that, because that is handing power to social media platforms. And history has shown that they will always use outliers like Alex Jones, but then they will turn on the left, which is really weak. So you already have, Glenn Greenwald wrote a column about this today. They're going after Substack. And I've already been hit with algorithms. After the Director of National Intelligence report came out in 2017, it went after RT. I have a show on RT America. And they had 7 pages in there attacking RT, which kind of exposed what their anger towards RT was. It had nothing to do with Russian propaganda. It's the fact that those shows gave platforms to Black Lives Matter activists, to anti-fracking activists, to third-party candidates. And so then I was writing for Truthdig before we all went on strike, and then we all got fired. But we did a graph that last year and impressions. So if you went to Google and you typed in imperialism, and I had written an article recently on imperialism, it would come up with anything else that was current. The algorithms essentially steered you away from that content. So referrals from impressions on Truthdig over a 12-month period declined from over 700,000 to below 200,000. Now they're probably even lower. I mean, WikiLeaks was the first publication they really went after. I mean, that was the template. It's giving this kind of power. I mean, we saw these digital platforms work on behalf of the Biden administration. So when the contents or some of the contents of Hunter Biden's discarded laptop were exposed in the New York Post, the New York Post was locked out of its own Twitter account. And that's really dangerous. We don't want to give these corporations, remember, Amazon has, I think, a $600 billion contract, or it must be million, I guess, $600 million contract with the CIA. I mean, these people are not our friends, and we don't want to give them the power of that kind of censorship.
What about the argument that we should do what we can? So if it means censoring Nazis, for example, even though it might bite us in the butt, if we can prevent hateful ideas, why not use the tools such as
but who's we?
The left, I suppose.
Left doesn't have any power. They're not the ones doing it.
Okay.
Google, Facebook, and Twitter. These are not the left, and they're not our friends. And we don't want to give them that power because they'll wipe us out.
Understood.
The whole goal is to steer people back to establishment media organizations like the New York Times, which is why the New York Times is colluding with all this.
We're going to move on to a second video question. Aaron, could you bring up Ikara?
Hello, thank you for speaking with us today. So my question is about how you've been speaking about a revolution as sort of what we need. And so in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and sort of the social upheaval that started last year, which has kind of died down now, is the stage set for a populist revolution, or are we sort of going back into the American psychosis?
So I think the tinder is there. I mean, I covered uprisings and revolutions around the world, including the 2 Palestinian intifadas. And as a reporter, you knew that there could be a conflagration, but you never knew what would set it off. And it's always something relatively banal. So for instance, in the first Intifada, it was a car accident where a bunch of Palestinian day laborers were killed. I think they were in a van and they were hit by an Israeli truck or something. And that just was, it was the final kind of straw that saw, and the PLO and everybody wasn't expecting it. So that's how it works. That was true in East Germany. That was true in Czechoslovakia. It was true in Romania. I mean, you had a moment where Ceausescu and Elena come out on the balcony, and then the crowd just starts to boo, and they can't get to the roof of the palace fast enough to get a helicopter out. So, that happened in Tunisia when the fruit vendor lit himself on fire. So it's there. Now, that backlash can be a right-wing backlash, but this is my fear with the Biden administration, that by not addressing the root cause of our malaise, they are guaranteeing blowback. And given the destruction of the left and the disorganization among the left, that blowback, I fear, will be a kind of Trumpian proto-fascist blowback.
Thank you, Ikra. Do you have another question you want to ask? Oh, she just.
Oh, I guess my other question was sort of like, where do you find hope in having the knowledge about all of this and the way the world is sort of going?
So I think part of the problem with the left is that they have no real relationships with people who are oppressed. So all of my life, I was in El Salvador, Nicaragua. I was in the Middle East, months of my life in Gaza. I was in Sarajevo and Kosovo during the war. And I came back and I immediately started teaching in the prison system. So if you don't walk out of that prison system angry, then you don't have a heart. Something's wrong with you. And I think that when oppressed peoples become abstractions, it's very easy to fall into despair or become cynical. But I walk out of that prison and I'm out, and they're not. I walk out of the largest open-air prison in the world, which is Gaza, and I'm out and they're not. And to somehow not fight back is to betray people I care about and have built relationships with. And I think that's where, Augustine said, hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are and the courage to see that they don't remain the way they are. I don't know how familiar you are with the Palestinian struggle, but it's been long. And, let's be frank, it's things have gotten worse and worse and worse, but should we stop? And the mechanism of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, I don't think there's one university that has de-invested, but what that movement has done is raise consciousness. And that's why Israel is so frightened of it. But I have friends in Palestine. I can't be outside and do nothing. I couldn't live with myself. So I think anger, which is different from hate, but anger at what's done to people I care about, and on a very personal level.
Someone asked, thank you, Ikra, for that question, and thank you for the answer, Chris. Can you elaborate on Israel's role in U.S. elections? Someone asked that.
Well, you can't vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs, and you can't vote against the interests of the right-wing Israeli government. You can't. We have to be clear that this isn't Israel. It's the rabid right wing of Israel, the racists, and they are racists. And I saw that because I covered Rabin. I knew Rabin, and Rabin, who had no deep love for the Palestinians, at least recognized that the occupation was destroying Israel from the inside, which I think it now already has.
Yeah.
And so Rabin pushed through Oslo, and his fiercest opponents were the Israel lobby from the United States, in particular AIPAC, who funded Likud at the time and hated Rabin. I mean, they were American Jews outside Rabin's house in Herzliya picketing him. Bibi was holding rallies with allowing followers to dress Rabin in a Nazi uniform, an effigy of Rabin, and burn it. And of course, this is dangerous because eventually it led to Rabin's assassination. And until the day she died, Leah Rabin, Rabin's widow, blamed Bibi for his murder, and she wasn't wrong. So we have to be clear that it's a particular strain. Now, I think the problem is that since they've essentially closed the occupied territories off from Israel, there was a point when large numbers of Palestinian day workers would come into Israel. At least there was some kind of contact. Now there's none. So Israel, which had at one point a semblance of a kind of peace wing or liberal wing, is now really replicated the apartheid state of South Africa, not only in terms of the way it treats the Palestinians, but in terms of the overt racism that is expressed by most Israelis.
I was born in Israel. I would agree with her. I would agree with everything.
Where?
Yeah. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Where?
In Tel Aviv.
Oh, okay.
So, but I do agree with everything you say. Yeah. All right, moving on. We have Jordan Ramos. Oh, and I just want to say, in terms of the hopelessness of Israel, it's true, but there are, left-leaning and even fully open communist and socialist parties that are trying their best.
Yeah, they were bigger because I first went to Israel in '88, and so they've shrunk. You still have Aretz. I mean, the best reporting on the Palestinians comes from people like Amira Haas and Danny Rubenstein. They're pretty amazing Jewish Israeli reporters. But that kind of Uri Avneri, that wing was larger, and it's certainly shrinking, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm in New York, not Israel. So,
but you've had 1 million Israelis have left the country, and those are the people who, I don't want to demonize everyone who remained behind, but a lot of those people are the ones who had a conscience.
Yeah. All right, Aaron, can you bring up Jordan Ramos?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Chris, what do you think of the Democratic Party staffers in Nevada leaving after Democrat Socialists taking over leadership? And I also want to ask, what do you think of do you think that the left should focus on winning local state elections, because that's what in the past the Koch brothers had put a lot of funding into those races because the state rights and state elections, due to having some, I think, an impact in general elections. In your opinion.
So I think the problem is that you need so much money to run. I mean, the way the system's built, and the left just doesn't have that kind of money, so you can't get airtime. I mean, Ralph would say, he'd go to Madison Square Garden and speak to 10,000 people, but he never reached a television audience, which would be in the millions. He couldn't. Bernie was the same. Bernie, to his credit, raised money through small donations. I think that our priority should not be electoral politics. I think our priority should be building disciplined, organized, militant, popular movements. And electoral politics can be part of that movement, but shouldn't be the primary focus. We have to rebuild those organizations because the only strength we have is in our numbers. And if we use those numbers correctly, we can pit power against power, but that requires organization. And I think, getting sucked into the electoral system and putting all of your energy into it is a mistake, which doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but that shouldn't be your primary focus.
Thank you, Jordan. Someone asked Anakin Jackson, I'm not sure if that's a real name. In Empire of Illusion, you speak at length about corporate media and the monopolization of what information we consume. I'm a film student and also fascinated by your work. You're critical of the role that visual media, film, television have in the distortion of our reality. In your view, is there a way in which you can create deep, meaningful art in the wave of, but still avoid spectacle?
I think the problem is that when people rely on visual images for information and sever themselves from a print-based culture, they're easily manipulated because images are emotionally driven. The actual script of the word count of, let's say, a 90-minute documentary, I don't know what it is, but it doesn't compare to a book. So I used to cover Israel, used to cover Palestine, and I would write 800 or 1,000 word stories. But I came to see that if you didn't understand what happened in 1948, if you hadn't heard of Deir Yassin, if you didn't know about Sabra and Shatila, if you, in some ways, everything I wrote was out of context. So I think that the answer would be yes, as long as it's within the context of a historical framework that is only possible through print. I love documentaries, and I watch them all the time. I love good documentaries. But I think the problem with a society that is solely dependent on images is that they lose so much context that they're easily swayed one way or another, and they don't have the kind of critical faculties to judge, I guess would be the best way to put it.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, whoever asked that question. Aaron, is Samuel Gantier here? He's the vice president of our undergraduate student government. He'd like to ask a question. Aaron, are you bringing up Sam? Okay.
Hey, how you doing? So my question is, due to the impact of COVID-19, you see that in New York that they're starting something called a COVID passport. My question is, what do you think will be its effects in the rest in all of America, and do you think it will affect the minority and poor class?
Well, first of all, we know that a disproportionate number of people in the healthcare industry are people of color. I think in Maryland, it's like 44% or something. The figure's probably not exactly right. I don't have them in front of me, but in terms of people who've gotten vaccinated, that they only account for like 16%. So you already have a healthcare system, which of course is profit driven, that is, and you've seen with the consolidation of hospitals and closing of hospitals, how poor communities have lost access to medical care. So you already have that assault. And then in terms of the passport, that's one more way to register you, and it's one more way to exclude you. And everything is more difficult when you're poor, not just in terms of the logistics, but the access, because the access is disproportionate. It's like voting. If you go to a poor area in Georgia, the lines are 12 hours long, and if you go to a fancy white neighborhood, a suburb outside of Atlanta, you can vote in 20 minutes. So the whole system now is designed against the poor, and I think that that passport system will be no exception.
Thank you for that, Sam and Chris. Aaron, can you bring up Christian Kozlov?
Hello, is it my turn?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Chris. I appreciate the talk. We disagree on most things, but I have a few questions to ask. So given that from your writings, it sounds like you attack crony capitalism, and that crony capitalism is a product of the state. So wouldn't it logically follow that, we should be attacking crony capitalism, not capitalism itself? And because I think that the best cure for society would be a free market, which you contend it doesn't exist. What do you think?
Well, I don't know how after 2018 anybody can pretend the free market exists. I mean, that was socialism for the rich on a massive scale. I mean, if people really believed in the free market, then all of these banks, AIG and Citibank, and they all would have gone under. I mean, it's a fantasy. It doesn't exist. I mean, my problem with capitalism is that it brings with it a kind of ethic, and that ethic is one of exploitation, of deception, of hoarding, of inequality. And, I have a dark enough view of human nature to know that there are people who are in any society who are driven by that, but it has to be heavily regulated, because once it takes over, I mean, this is why Marx called capitalism at its core a revolutionary force, because once it takes over, and go back, and Marx was right about this, that what it does is it begins, after it devastates the system, which it has already done in the United States, it cannibalizes the very structures that make capitalism possible. So they want to privatize healthcare. They want to privatize education. 60% of intelligence work are done by private agencies like Bose Allen Hamilton. I have to go to these halfway houses that are all privatized, and they're not trying to provide any kind of care to people making that transition from prison to freedom. It's just all about exploitation. So, you don't want, for instance, capitalists to control your health service. You create a system, as we have, where parents are forced to bankrupt themselves to save their sons and daughters. So, but the whole notion of a free market, especially now, is a myth. I mean, all these large financial service firms are being given money at virtually 0% interest. And then, of course, how do they make their money? It's as soon as we can't pay our credit card on time, we're paying 18% interest. I don't even know whether that's capitalism or not. I think it's just extortion.
Okay, and I have a second question. In your writings, you also attack like capitalism for problems of our environment. You may make like a lot of comments about our environment and our issues in our environment. But I have to ask, like, what is your opinion on like nuclear energy, given that it's clean and efficient and like it's safe, but it's also really regulated. So like, do you also believe that fossil fuel has not made humans like also like improved in their lives, for example?
Well, who is it improved? I mean, whose lives? It's not improved for the people in the global south. It's improved for those elites in the industrialized north. And we create most of the pollution and they pay most of the cost. In terms of nuclear power, it's a matter of storage. You had in Japan with tsunami, when these reactors get hit, they poison the entire environment around it. So Chernobyl, I mean, there's all sorts of examples. So when you talk about it being safe and controlled, given the incredible longevity of this radioactive material, and the fact that you have this stuff often stored in barrels, in sand pits, I mean, everybody knows that there is, or they will put them down in mines. Eventually the storage facilities corrode. And then what do you do? So, I think the fact is by severing our reliance on fossil fuel, at the same time, we also have to radically reconfigure our own relationship to the environment in terms of our own consumption and our lifestyle. That also has to go with it.
Thank you, Christian. Andy Halili asked, what's your take on the current Muslim Holocaust in China? His words.
Well, I mean, I from a distance, so I've not been there. And as a reporter, I am always somewhat skeptical of places I haven't reported from. I don't think there's any question that the Uyghur community is targeted, and that the forms of surveillance, many of them facial recognition cameras put up in public areas, et cetera, are kind of what's coming to us. But at the same time, these are kind of the only Muslims America seems to care about anywhere in the world. And that means that they have a vested interest in promoting and perhaps even exaggerating those human rights abuses as a way to demonize China. But I don't speak as an expert. But that Uyghurs have been targeted. I mean, Uyghurs have long been targeted in Xinjiang. That's not anything new. It's what Chomsky calls, acceptable and unacceptable victims. So, when I covered the war in Central America, there were Catholic priests who were murdered by the death squads in El Salvador, and the Reagan administration didn't say anything. And at the same time, the communist government in Poland killed a Catholic priest, and it was all over the front pages of every paper, and they couldn't stop talking about it. And so the Uyghurs have been adopted by imperial powers as a way to discredit China. And I don't want to defend China; it's a totalitarian system, but the Chinese have lifted 180 million people out of extreme poverty. I mean, and now those are World Bank figures, by the way; they're not Chinese government figures.
Thank you for that, Chris. You mentioned Glenn Greenwald earlier today, that you read his article. There's a lot of controversy surrounding him lately, especially since he just said that Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon are true socialists. How would you square that with?
I saw that. I know Glenn and admire a lot of his work. I don't know how he could tag Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon as socialists. That argument kind of went. I didn't get that one.
It's probably because you're not on Twitter, Chris.
I'm not on Twitter, but you can't get it. As Chomsky says, I'm not on Twitter because you can't say anything meaningful on Twitter. But I mean, I don't know what he means by that. I had a Bannon and first of all, I've never watched Carlson in my life. I don't have a TV, so I've never seen him, not once.
He might be our next president, so you should probably check him out.
I guess I'll be surprised when he comes. But I don't know what Glenn meant by that. I just don't.
Okay. Why don't we do a last question before we let you go, Chris? Sorry, there was just hello. I don't understand. This is from an anonymous person. Hello, I don't understand why should we only use peaceful protests when the state seems used to suppressing peaceful protests, as seen in BLM, which seems to preach only peaceful protests but get demonized. How do we get people to react when they're in their own bubbles?
Okay, so that's two questions. I mean, there is a moral aspect to not using violence, although, by extension, I used violence. When I was covering northern Iraq after Saddam withdrew, the stories saw Saddam Hussein put a price on my head and on the head of other aid workers and journalists who were there, one of whom, a friend of mine, a German photographer, Lizzie Schmidt, was killed. Others, a Swedish film crew, had their car blown up. They were very badly injured. A guy from CARE was shot and killed. So I had 7 bodyguards, and they certainly would have pulled the trigger if we came under attack. So, there are moments when I accept the necessity of violence. I just think it's important to realize that revolutions, and who wrote about this quite presciently of all people was Lenin. Even though Lenin's brother was executed for being involved in a plot to assassinate the Tsar, Lenin himself kept trying to stomp down anarchist violence because he saw it as detrimental to the revolution. Revolutions work because they're primarily nonviolent, in the same way that even though there was an armed wing to the ANC, by the time the apartheid regime was overthrown, what brought it down were massive largely nonviolent protests, especially out of the townships, as well as the sanctions that were imposed from the outside on the apartheid regime. So, revolutions work when you essentially, when regimes are so discredited that nobody wants to defend them. I mean, and you just go back and look. I mean, for instance, when the Shah fled Iran, the next day, the head of the armed forces said that the armed forces wouldn't fire in the streets of Tehran or Qom or anywhere else to defend the regime. That's it. It was over. And that's the moment you need to reach. But it's very hard to reach that when you use violence. Even if you look at the Cuban, I mean, one of the biggest damage that, the most damaging thing that the Cuban revolutionaries did, and I love Che, I think Che is a fascinating figure, is this whole FOCO theory. In fact, what brought down Batista and the Cuban regime were nationwide strikes, which crippled the country. And when Batista fled the country, Fidel and the Barbudos were, 4 days away. They had to hop in the trucks to get into Havana. So yes, they were certainly, but then the mythology of the revolution came, centered around the FOCO being that kind of violent group that led members of Students for a Democratic Society to form the Weather Underground, even though the North Vietnamese told them not to, in the anti-war movement. And then that saw, of course, Che killed and executed on the orders of Washington, on the orders of the US government in Bolivia when he tried to build a kind of FOCO in Bolivia. So, if I was an Iraqi or an Afghani and my country was being occupied by US NATO forces, yes, of course, then, in wars of occupation, you are only going to drive the occupier out through violence primarily. Although, again, you have Gandhi's example in India, but then people say, would Gandhi have been able to do it without the British press, which is a kind of fair question. Also, you have to accept that the British ruling class and the military was decimated after World War I, so they didn't have the bodies either in order to occupy the empire. But my argument within the United States is that it isn't going to work. There is a moral component to it, but when faced with the possibility of annihilation, as I was in Sarajevo, I fully understood why the Muslim-led government in Sarajevo, in fact, I was quite angry at the international community for the arms blockade, which meant that the Muslims had small arms and small mortars, and the Serbs were dropping Katyusha rockets and the equivalent of 155 howitzers and 90-millimeter tank rounds on us by the hundreds, day in and day out. It was just, unacceptable. So there are moments when I would put it this way: you don't have a choice but to use violence. But to go down the route of violence by challenging the ruling elites in the United States, I think, is a disaster. We can't do that language. I mean, we have 36,000 people in the American Armed Forces that are in special forces units, SEALs, Marine, Range. I've seen these people at work. These are death squads. And they have an efficiency to kill that we're never going to be able to replicate. And so if we go down that route, we're going to lose.
That's very clarifying. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for attending this event. It was a pleasure to host it. And again, thank you, Chris, for sharing your knowledge and experience with us.
All right. Thanks for inviting me.
Good night and good luck, everyone.